You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Cannon Fodder. Here are your hosts, Mark Mulcaster, Brian Cameron, Matt Booker, and Mark Newbold.
Grab your bookmarks, it's time to take cover as we unleash the cannon fodder over the Star Wars galaxy of literature. This episode we welcome New York Times best-selling author of Star Wars Brotherhood, Mike Chen. We discuss the writing of the book, its place in the Star Wars timeline, the crafting of the original and familiar characters in the book, and much, much more in this special episode of Cannon Fodder. So this is myself and Mike Chen talking all things Star Wars Brotherhood. Mike, welcome to Cannon Fodder. I've been looking forward to this for ages because I wanted to speak to you since I knew the book was coming out, of course. But having read it, I was even more keen to speak to you. So thanks for giving us your time.
Thank you for having me.
How's life with you? You must be basking in the glow of a job well done, I would assume.
I'd say like in maybe the week before release, starting to get the good reviews come in, this started to make me feel much more secure about what I'd done. Because there's always that worry that like with my own books, if you fail, then it's like, oh, I'm probably going to fail to get another contract or something like that. But if I screw up Star Wars, not only do I screw up this thing that I love, I screw up my opportunity to impact the thing that I love. And so for people to say that not only do they really enjoy it, they feel like one of the best notes that I keep consistently getting is this is not just a fun adventure. This is like essential to who Anakin and Obi-Wan are, and it supports the films and the Clone Wars, and it makes all of that better. And like that is the best feedback I could possibly get. I mean, if people just said like, I liked it, it was fun, and on to the next book, then it's like, okay, well, I did my job, and that's good. Like people didn't hate it, but for it to feel that level of like, this is important, and it was done well, like that's really important. And it's so much better than like, we hated it, you messed up.
You make a great point because yes, you are essentially playing in somebody else's sandbox and picking up threads that were written by different writers over various periods of time. What is the real pressure? Is it the pressure on yourself because you're a fan and you want to get it right? Is it pressure because it is somebody else's sandbox, if you want to use that phrase? And also because coming out the back of Attack of the Clones, I mean, this really feels like a very direct sequel to Clones. Not that it isn't, but this is really bumper to bumper, that you've got to catch that mood and highlight what they've been through in that film, but that they're moving forward into the Clone Wars.
So there's a few challenges there. The goal is to bridge Attack of the Clones and the Clone Wars, because I know one thing that I have always personally found not necessarily jarring, but I wondered how it happened is like when you start Clone Wars, like when you jump into the Clone Wars movie and you see Anakin and Obi-Wan, they're kind of like joking with each other, very similar in tone to the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. And then you're like, well, I thought there's only like, a few months have passed. So how do they go from you will be expelled from the Jedi Order, I don't care, yelling at each other, on top of Geonosis? How do you go from that to the beginning of the Clone Wars movie? And so it's both a challenge and something that I really wanted to figure out or to see for myself. So it was a bit daunting at first. I wrote out a pitch for my editor. So my editor, we talked really early on, like right after my agent called with the offer. And my editor said, let's talk in a week, but think about some ideas. We want it to be about that business on Cato Nemoidia. We want it to be about Anakin and Obi-Wan during like this time period. And so I thought that was going to be really difficult at first. But I think because I've absorbed these characters so much, it quickly unlocked for me. It was like, oh no, wait, this was already there. And it was just, they were hiding it from each other because of their roles of master and apprentice. And once I had that epiphany, everything just kind of locked into place and I was able to start like working on it. So chronologically, I looked at it as Attack of the Clones. Queen's Hope takes place immediately after that. And I got an early copy of that over the summer, like right when I started working on it. And then there's some gap between the end of Queen's Hope and like the Clone Wars movie. And I don't think it's even officially ever defined like what that gap is. So I just treated it as like a few months in my head. And so knowing that, I'm like, okay, I'm going to stick something like right in the middle of that. That's the arc. And what I have to capture is like the emotional transition for Anakin and Obi-Wan. The Clone Wars, there are themes in the book about like the pace of war, like the chaos of it, like why are the Jedi doing it? And those are very important, but they are, I think, secondary to the emotional transition for Anakin and Obi-Wan.
If people look at it, they always seem to frame it that Anakin's the one that's having the hardest time with the changes, but the book makes you realize, and it's well timed, obviously, with Obi-Wan coming out and the focus being back on him. It's every bit as hard for Obi-Wan to make that adjustment as well, which I found really interesting throughout the book, that he's constantly thinking, I wish Anakin was here. I wish my brother was here, you know, as it goes on to become, but friendship and bond is clearly there, and it's forged by what happens at the end of Attack of the Clones. So like you say, you think of Clones and Sith, but it isn't Clones and Sith, it's Clones and the Clone Wars.
I read that some people say like their favorite parts of the book are when Anakin and Obi-Wan are together. But I feel like it follows a structure similar to Attack of the Clones. And that was very, very, I wanted to like mirror the story structure, but then because it's a familiar story structure that just happened prior to the events of the book, we could see how they've changed, you know, in this short time period. So that was intentional. And I feel like if they are together like across the whole of the book and they're just bantering the whole time, then there's no place for introspection. And that's really, really important. And I think that's what happens in real life. You know, we're in transitionary periods, like, you know, children move to college, or, you know, you move across the country, or you get married or whatever. It's like you kind of rush into it because like the chaos of whatever you're changing into makes it really hard to get your head out of the clouds with it. But then when you have a moment of a break and you really like start to process what has happened and what's different, that's when I think things like start to really sink in. And that's what I wanted to do with Anakin and Obi-Wan here. And it helps that like they're new characters that act as foil to help them along this process. And that also was very important.
Obviously, Anakin and Obi-Wan have this dynamic change that's happening that we watch very organically happen throughout the book, which was one of the real strengths of it, I found. But also, Anakin's just entered into a marriage with Padme, and there's stolen moments happening there, which again is a rhythm that they have to find throughout the next 3 years until Revenge of the Sith. How did you find working that in? Because it's not primary to the plot, but it's essential to the plot.
Yeah. When I was asked in the weeks coming up to release, like, is Padme in this? And I would always say that she's not in it much, but every scene that she's in is really, really important. So right when I got my outline approved, I messaged E.K. Johnston. She said she heard that there was going to be an Anakin book coming out. So she was like, when I messaged her, she was really happy. It was me. That was cool. So we talked about, because I said, like, you know, you are Padme's keeper. So I need you to make sure that I am doing this in your voice. Everything that I focused with Padme, it's through Anakin's point of view, but I needed still to feel like Kate's Padme, because I feel like she's done like the most work with like getting into Padme's head. So timeline wise, Attack of the Clones happens, Queen's Hope happens, where they get married and they have like a brief honeymoon before they get separated. And then there's like some undetermined time where I'm sure someone's going to insert further stories. And then there's my book. So my book takes place like they haven't seen each other in, you know, a few weeks, a few months, whatever. And so when they come back together, one of the big things is like we don't ever get to see them casual. Like in Queen's Hope, they're getting married, they have a honeymoon, and then they go off and do their separate missions. So it's still kind of in that sort of like very extreme circumstances for them. So my book, I just wanted to show them like, why do they like each other? Because I mean, they're both really hot, you know, like that's, they're both young and hot. And like, yeah, that's great. But there has to be like a true personality attraction between them. And so I wanted to sneak in a few chapters of date night, because we just never, ever get to see that. So I wanted to show that outside of the fact that, you know, opposites attract, where Padme is like very intellectual, like she's super driven, but she's also very intellectual. So she's like constantly deconstructing the situation and thinking about like, how do we make it better? And then Anakin is all emotions. He's like, I want to make it better, but I don't know how to do that. So you have like this yin and yang. And then it when you understand that, and then you see them interact in a way that's like not Attack of the Clones, it's possible to see why they fit so well together. And you know, Kate and I, we had talked, I think about a month ago, when the conversation was, if like Mace took down Palpatine, or if the Jedi somehow got rid of Palpatine, would Padme and Anakin, would they have made it? And we both agreed, like, yeah, they totally would have, because you can see how they are built for each other, and they're both young. But I think if they had taken out Palpatine and say they had the twins and they retired off to Naboo and they're just like good neighbors, on Naboo or something, there definitely would have been some rocky moments in like the first 10 years of their marriage, but they would have made it and they would have been happy. And that's kind of like my guiding light with like writing this stuff. I feel like Obi-Wan probably wasn't experienced enough to handle a problem child like Anakin at the time, but it doesn't matter if it had been Qui-Gon or Yoda or whoever, like as long as you have Palpatine in there, because Obi-Wan and Anakin, like they get out of it, and because of like the angst and the trouble, like they probably are even closer because of it. But it doesn't matter who mentored Anakin. Palpatine is there from day one. Palpatine meets them on Naboo at the end of Attack of the Clones, and he's there pushing the buttons. So as long as you have Palpatine in there, I feel like this was going to happen. What I wanted to do with Anakin and Padme was to imagine like a place where that wasn't always inevitable, and kind of like work to that, like, because that's where they both think it's going to that, that happy ending. And so it was important to really showcase that, like, without too much of a sense of doom. My wife just finished reading it, and she was telling me that like the Anakin and Padme scenes made her so melancholy, because she's like, they really do love each other and they really are a good fit for each other. And you just know what happens. And so like playing with it with the mindset, like you don't know what's going to happen. And they're just a happy couple, like finding each other, like any young couple in their 20s. That's the real tragedy right there. You don't even have to paint any brushes of like Palpatine working his way in there, because like we already know. And that's where all the heaviness comes from. We were joking that like if they ever do a what if series for Star Wars, that Kate could write the Padme chapters and I could write the Anakin chapters, and we can take a look at them at like age 45.
You mentioned earlier new characters coming into it, and I think the predominant ones are Roog, Keetar, Mill. When you were working these characters out, Mill felt like a precursor to Ahsoka, to have Anakin be used to the kids, give a bit more poignancy to the scene in Revenge of the Sith. Was that all part of the mixture towards making that character? Yeah,
so there's two elements that were really key for finding someone for Anakin when devising Mill. And so one of them was like, he had to show mentorship skills, because I know like one of the things that I always found jarring about the Clone Wars movie, I mean, I understand it from like a marketing perspective. It's like, Anakin has a Padawan. Who is she? It's like, oh, that's interesting. Like, no, I'm excited for this movie, but like, you kind of want to know why. Like, it's not like right before, I forget the name of the planet from Clone Wars. Is it Christophsis?
Christophsis, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like they just got there and they're like, oh yeah, it's cool, take her. Like there had to be something building towards that. So one of the goals was to show that leadership recognized that Anakin has his own like inherent mentoring and leadership traits, and like they know this could be good for him. So like that journey was important. At the same time, whoever this was had to be like the anti-Ahsoka. It couldn't be a replica of that relationship, and he's a very good big brother to Ahsoka. And so like this had to feel different. There could not be any sort of like snips type of banter. Mill was designed to be an emotional foil for Anakin. And like the big thing is Mill is an empath. So Mill can like just decipher emotions. That's her connection to the Force. And we know that poor Anakin, he's all emotions. and he's always hiding parts of it. Like his giant struggle is like trying to contain his emotions, because no one ever taught him this. And I know George Lucas had talked about like, why did you put Anakin at 9 in the Phantom Menace? And he said like, that's like the worst time to like, it's never good to lose your parents. No. But like, that's like, he often talked about like how like that is like the worst time to do it, because like you're not quite a teenager, not quite a child. We know Anakin, like he hides himself from Obi-Wan, he hides himself from Padme, he hides himself even like from Palpatine, which the book goes into a little bit. But with Mill, because of her abilities, even without him realizing this, she sees all of that. And she's the first time that outside of being in Anakin's head, like we get an outside character who is able to see all of him. And that was really, really important, not just from like a reader surrogate perspective, but to have someone like that be able to impact Anakin and for him to understand that like he's not hiding anymore, and for them to like to build a relationship based on that. It's very, very different from Ahsoka. And so it does work for the reader, but it also does work for Anakin to grow and start to understand himself.
Hello, I'm Ahmed Best, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Roog and Keetar. Roog, I love the character, and Keetar, such an angry, bitter, understandably after what's happened to the whole Kadasura district, angry man. Kaitan Neimoidia obviously is established because that's the whole crux of that mission that we harken back to from Revenge of the Sith. But how interesting was it to throw a different light via these two new characters, but just on the Neimoidians as a species in the whole?
When I was talking with my editor, Alex Davis, about this, so we brought up like that business on Cato Neimoidia, and he had two, like they weren't mandates, but they were suggestions. He said like the Del Rey team would like to use this opportunity to give some depth to the Neimoidians as a people. And then he also said like, it would be cool if we had a badass Neimoidian, to kind of like ground that. And so that's really like where Roog comes from. But like as a people, and the more that Alex and I talked about this, after I gave him my very short synopsis that he bought off on, which it actually made it into like the book, like the initial synopsis that I wrote became the bones of this book. We were talking about the Neimoidians, and I said, like, I think about Star Trek Deep Space Nine and what they did with the Ferengi, and how in like Next Generation, the Ferengi are like literally a joke character. Yeah. And then Deep Space Nine like gives them a culture and a background, and you see like a whole range of what they are like. And that's what I was thinking. And also Alex is a huge DS9 fan. So we got it right away.
Same. Yeah.
So with the culture, it was just, I thought about how pretty much anytime you go to a foreign culture, like no matter what it is, like, you have the ideas that you've read and watched about. And then when you immerse yourself on the ground level, it's just different. And you see the difference between like individual people and like even in like our current real world political situation, like around the world and all the terrible things that are happening, you see the difference between, the real people on the ground and like what the choices that governments are making. And then also the impact of like government messaging on those people on the ground. So I wanted to reflect a lot of that. And one thing that, I've personally found, and I think a lot of people find this, is like learning about other cultures often comes from their food, their films, or, their books or their video games that they make locally, things like that. When we get to see art from their point of view, then we start to understand that like, oh, it's like the stuff that we create, but it's different. You see like the way that their local culture and their local flavor influences it. And so I wanted to really bring that to the Neimoidians to show that like there's a wide breadth of them. And with Roog in particular, because we get the line from Qui-Gon where Qui-Gon says like these Federation types are cowards. And like, you are painting with a wide brush there, Qui-Gon. Yeah. And so it was with Roog, I wanted, similar to Mill and Anakin with Roog, I wanted a foil for Obi-Wan. So Obi-Wan, he's got all this faith in his institution because it's like, why wouldn't he? Like, these are the rules that he's been working with since he was a baby. And, it's the rules that the galaxy plays by. And I wanted Roog to be like, no. I believe in my people and I love my people, but I've seen so much politics, like you wouldn't believe it. So like, and they've told me to kill all sorts of people. So to have basically both of them running on faith, but in different contexts, like that's why they're such great foil for each other. Roog in particular. So I talked about the Deep Space Nine influence, not just with the Ferengi, but like the tone of the book is very much DS9 and like the gray morality. And then Roog, I pictured her as Major Kira meets Mass Effect's Garrus Vakarian. Like there's a real sharp blend of those two in there. When I was writing her dialogue, I totally heard Kira's voice the whole time. And that's why I gave her maroon armor to be like Kira's Bajoran outfit.
Hi, this is Guy Henry, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. Enjoy.
You mentioned him earlier, Palpatine. He's constantly in the background. There's a wonderful sequence with Obi-Wan obviously speaking to the Neimoidian chamber, trying to get to the bottom of the investigation. And you can see he's thinking, he all but says it to himself, we're all being played here, but who's playing us? And it's foreshadowing, obviously, we know it's Palpatine playing everybody, and he's there whispering in the background. How judicious did you have to be in using Palpatine at this point of the war?
It's funny, like those scenes were almost like the funnest to write, because I tried to write it so that if somehow some random person picked up this Star Wars book and was reading it, without ever watching Star Wars, like I wanted to play so like they could read it and they could read it perfectly straight. But I think 99% of readership is going to know that it's always Palpatine. It's like, somehow Palpatine has turned into the villain. So knowing that, like, it's important that he wasn't too overt. And I think one of the really great things about Palpatine is that like he's not omniscient. He is extremely good at reading people and situations and adapting. Like beyond being a Sith, that is his strength. So there's two big scenes with Palpatine. Like one of them is with Anakin and one of them is with Obi-Wan. And there's a big difference in there because the one with Anakin is like pure manipulation. Like every single thing he said, like every line is very calculated to show that Palpatine understands Anakin's buttons, and every word that he says is just pushing them. Like he's saying the truth, but he's framing that truth in a way that just heightens Anakin's like disdain for like Mace Windu or whoever. It's like, he's totally playing with him under the guise of being the friendly uncle.
Yes.
And with Obi-Wan, he's back in like his political arena. So he knows when to like just to step back and be like, okay, I'm going to let these two parties just like sabotage each other, because he's got like his fingers on the Republic Army. He's got his fingers with the Separatists, but he knows that it's very important that like it has to play out for people to believe it. There's a point where he interrupts the conversation and he's like, yeah, we're going to do that. And so that's the whole thing about Palpatine like being really great at adapting, is like he will nudge pieces into place and then he'll just kind of let it play out. Like he's smart enough to know like not to force it. He just has to set everything up. And then as soon as things begin to tumble into place, that's when he says like, yep, we're going to do that. And like he stops anything from possibly taking it out of that situation. That's the beauty of writing Palpatine. With the political stuff, you could just read it as politics in a time of war, like if you're reading it straight. But if you see like, oh, that is a strategic decision because dude is in control of everything.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Am I right in saying this is the canonical introduction of Asajj Ventress?
It is, yeah. When I wrote the pitch, we just rewatched Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. So like we just rewatched that the other night. And like my original pitch, the whole thing was very much like Star Trek VI in that there was no defined villain. It was a political morality play. And about like the second or third draft through the synopsis, my editor said like, we think we could use a really strong villain to kind of like not just focus the antagonism, but like to like move the plot along. And then he goes like, what do you think about Asajj? And I'm like, oh, I can use her? Like, what it was? It's like my own sense of imposter syndrome of like not wanting to seem like too fanboy about this.
Sure.
I'm like, I would love to throw Asajj in here, but I'm not going to ask for that. You're already giving me Anakin and Obi-Wan.
Yeah.
I didn't ask at first. I'm like, I'm asking for too much already. But then he was like, yeah, do you want to use Ventress? We know she knows them by the time the Clone Wars movie happens. So it's like, she's got to come in somewhere. And so writing her, she was so much fun because she's just, she's got such a strong voice and she's such a jerk to everyone. She's toying with them, but manipulating them at the same time. In the Clone Wars movie, like, and beyond, they already kind of like know her deal. So they're always kind of like trying to outmaneuver each other. But it was really great to be able to write Obi-Wan and like just have him be kind of blindsided and have to like pivot in real time to deal with her. One of the things that I tried to work in is the 2003 Genndy Clone Wars series.
Yeah.
And my basic approach to this was that the events shown in that series happened in some form. The series itself is the way that like a TV movie of historical events like is distorted. It's like 50 to 75% truth, but it's like stylized.
Sure.
And so the way that I try to picture it in my head is that this series is like, oh, the HoloNet is showing like highlights of the war. Like in anime, retrospective, and that's why all the Jedi have like heightened powers, and they like everything's like quick and cool and kind of funny. So it's basically like wartime propaganda in anime form for the Republic. So I took it as like the absolute bones of what happened there. Mace on Dantooine obviously did not, take on a billion battle droids by himself, but he did lead the charge, and there probably weren't thousands and thousands, is probably like dozens or something like that. So take the events of that series and then scale them back down on reality and not necessarily know what actually happened, just like a rough idea of. So, obviously Anakin fights Ventress in the Clone Wars series. So then I looked at that and I'm like, how am I going to make this fit with the timeline of Queen's Hope, with the timeline of the Genndy series, and the timeline of like the Clone Wars movie? Rewatching that fight sequence over and over, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. It's nighttime. It's dark, and it happens really, really quickly. And like they're all over the place in that. So if you're going with, that's just a heightened version in retrospect of what happened. So Anakin has a line in this book where he says, Dooku has sent his assassins for me before. Originally, I actually had like 2 paragraphs of exposition about Yavin 4. And then like the editorial team was like, we get what you're doing here, but this just like completely stops everything to like tie it in there. And like, it's not necessary, because people who know are going to know, and people who don't know are going to be like, what is this weird passage about like temples and stuff? So, okay. So I cut that. But then, so the idea is that it's dark, it's rainy, it's fast. Anakin knows someone was sent after him, but like he basically can't see her because like he's trying to fight her the whole time. But he's recognized her ship because like they were chasing each other in space over Yavin 4, like before that happens in the Clone Wars series. So it's like Anakin, he thinks he's seen the ship before. He's gotten a sense of this person before, and he knows Dooku has sent people after him. So it's like he's kind of like putting it together in real time. And so if you've seen the Genndy series, you'd know. And if you haven't, then like it doesn't bog it down. So like I had to work that in along with like establishing kind of like the foundation of like the Ventress Obi-Wan frenemy type of thing that plays out through the Clone Wars series. So it was a lot of fun. Like I'm really kind of surprised and thankful that they gave me the keys to do that, because I love Ventress. Ventress is like my daughter's favorite character. So it's like to be able to handle that with care and bring in the things that I wanted to acknowledge at the Genndy series was just super cool.
Hi, this is Julie Dolan, the voice of Princess Leia, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. It's your only hope.
Another key to the card that you got, essentially Dooku, who's really in his sort of manipulative phase at this point, because framing the Separatists and the Confederacy to be one thing as an opposition to the Republic. And as we learned over the years, there's a Separatist Council and the Republic Council. And so they are counterparts to a degree. How interesting was it writing that dance as well? Because with Asajj sort of whispering in people's ears like she does to Keetar, for example, you've got a real devious, duplicitous enemy who can subvert almost anything.
The best part about writing Dooku is hearing Christopher Lee's voice in my head. Like every line, I'm like, you just hear that like sort of like very, delicate gravel that he has. That's super fun. And I think with Dooku, like if you look at what he says to the Nemoidians, so there's a clear differentiation between like the Cato Nemoidian government and the Trade Federation. The Cato Nemoidian government is like local. They're like, I live in California. Our state operates differently from like the United States federal government. I wanted to kind of play it like that. But I also wanted to show that even though Cato Nemoidian is neutral, like Dooku is basically trying to influence to get all of like the resources towards like the Separatists.
Yeah.
So it's very subtle. Again, it's like one of those things where if you're going into this not knowing and you're just reading it straight, it's like you might miss it. But I think if you know the context of Dooku and the Separatists and the war, then you'll like that sort of manipulation going on. Same thing with like his relationship with Ventress. It's still very, very early on. It's basically like we see her trial in the Genndy Clone Wars series, which you can take as like semi-canon.
Yeah.
And so Ventress is still trying to prove herself at this point. And so when you see her trying to like be more than just a blunt instrument, she's really trying to like manipulate things. Like there's a big part of that is like she has to prove herself to Dooku. She has to prove that she's valuable because Dooku will just toss her away, and she knows that. So there's all these relationships going in there. And one of my favorite things to write was we know Dooku has a weak point for Qui-Gon Jinn.
Yes.
Like we see that in Attack of the Clones. And so for Obi-Wan to be able to like weaponize that, I love Dooku as a character. And I feel like he's not like everything that you've read, like Kevin Scott's Dooku and like what you see in Clone Wars is like, he's obviously like a full Sith and stuff, but he's still like a principled man. So for us to get like that just teeny tiny second, like where the door of morality opens up on him because of Qui-Gon Jinn, that was really important to show. Even with all the dark side in Dooku, there's still like affection for Qui-Gon because I just think like in Attack of the Clones, like the one moment of true sincerity from Dooku is when he says, I wish Qui-Gon was still here with me.
Yes.
It's like the way Christopher Lee plays it, it's like there's a heaviness to that I think that's completely sincere. Like he has a lot of affection for Qui-Gon and a lot of respect for him. So that was kind of like built into the whole thing. It's like he's manipulative, he's evil, but he's still got this teeny bit of morality anchored into his feelings about Qui-Gon.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, a Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
The other character that returns that we love to see, Dexter Jettster,
Yes,
bright spark in Attack of the Clones. He's got the inside track. He's a knowledgeable man. He's traveled the galaxy and he's Obi-Wan's friend. How did you build that up even more than what we saw in Attack of the Clones? Looking
at the parallel structure of like Obi-Wan's going to go off on an investigation and Anakin's going to go do like his thing. It had to feel logical. The main thing is like it couldn't just be like Obi-Wan's flying to Cato Nemoidia and then like he gets random phone call from Dex. Any sort of appearance by characters and Easter eggs too. Like I wanted them to feel completely organic, where it was someone had to fill that role from like a plot perspective. So then I put that person in instead of like I want to use this person. Let me build a plot around them, because that always feels forced. Like you can see that in any movie or book. And so with this, it was like Obi-Wan needs more information. He needs to go outside of the Jedi for that, because you can start to see the cracks here of like the Jedi. They're so caught up in like the pace of the war that like basically no one's going to be able to really help him. Again, he's got 24 hours to do this. So he has to go somewhere else. And so it just made sense that he trusts Dex. They have a long relationship. And in Attack of the Clones, Dex is like, oh yeah, this little metal thing, it's a Kamino saber dart. So just the fact that he knows that means that the dude knows something, and so when talking about Dex with my editor, he said like, you got like a wide open book to play with, like you can fill in his history. And so I thought like, well, to have that depth of knowledge, he's either a black market dude or he's a professor, and he's definitely not a professor. So the main thing that popped up right away was in Mass Effect, there's the idea of the shadow broker, the person that like trades information in the underworld and kind of like keeps information at a distance for people. And so like, oh, that would totally be Dex. He's just like this person that like, he's the one that everyone knows, but also kind of keeps them at a safe distance. And so the idea is that like, he was an information broker in the core worlds. Someone now has a wide, slate to play with to fill in those stories. And then I'm just figuring at some point, something happened and he's like, nah, I'm done. I'm going to go be a cook. I don't need to deal with this shit anymore.
It was a joy to see him. It really was. And the characterization, as with all the characters, and I think that's something I've seen a lot of over the last couple of weeks, people saying how spot on the characterization was. There's quite a forensic element to this book because there's so many threads coming into it. Was that something you enjoyed?
Oh, yeah. It was important to keep like a very tight focus on like the emotional journey aside. The plot is pretty intricate. And so I had to decide like what to show, what not to show, what to include, what not to include. And like, I didn't want to take it too far off from the investigation. Someone was asking me like, why didn't you include more clones? Because that would have been fun to see more of how they are at like this really early stage. And that's not my book to write. Like that is happening. And like, there's acknowledgement of that. Like both Obi-Wan and Anakin, like they think about like, oh, these clones like are just, trying to figure things out themselves. But that's the extent of it. Because if I spent too much time with the clones, then it gets away from this really tight story that is under time pressure, trying to deal with this investigation and then like react to the way the investigation turns. So it was really important to like build in layers of their, like, because we were factoring in like, you know, we've got to establish Ventress, we've got to establish like the Cato Neimoidian culture, we've got to establish like Anakin and Obi-Wan, like how they feel about each other. So suddenly running off with like a clone battalion or bringing Grievous in or something like that, it's like, you know, there's only so much space in this book, and it's because it's such a tight focus and the plot is really, really intricate and it keeps twisting. So that was a bit of a challenge. More for my own fanboy instincts, I'm really glad that because of the short, like I had 3 months to write this, which is just
wow.
insane.
Yeah.
Because it starts off with like, let's write like the most in-depth outline possible. It's nice that you get rid of the impulses to add in extra stuff like during the outline stage, because like I'm able to like talk it through with both my editor, and it has to be approved like all the way up the food chain through like the story group. So because of that, I got all of that out of the way before I actually started drafting, like just so when I'm plotting it, and then like my ideas of like, what if we do this? What if we do that? Like it's a conversation the whole time. So there's never any temptation to be like, let's have a huge clone subplot where, you know, they run off and the battalion does this, and we can show like, you know, how well they're executing as a strategy this early on in the war. And it's like, there's no need for that because it's kind of like filtered out during the beginning stages. During that plotting period, it was really important to just like stick to what was happening here, because I just didn't want to derail the momentum. Because it's a character book, and the first quarter of the book is like, it's a lot of setup, but it's also a lot of like character transition before things really go bonkers for these guys. I had to make sure that I didn't get too far off focus, because that would slow it down.
We've got Celebration coming up. Have you been before as a fan? Is it your first time?
This will be my first time. I think like just logistically, for whatever reason, like it just never was able to work. It's like before the pandemic, we tried to go to cons. Like we brought my daughter to her first con when she was a baby. So we just have never managed to get to Celebration. So like it's going to be really exciting. I paid way too much money to have my photo taken with Ewan McGregor. So
yeah, it's not cheap, is it?
No, it's not. If you're curious, us authors, we are way low on the totem pole, so we don't get perks.
But you're looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, this gets into like real world situation, but I have an immunocompromised family. So if you see me at Celebration, if you're listening to this at Celebration and you're seeking me out, I'm probably not going to be actually at the con too much. I will be signing Friday and Saturday, and I have a panel on Saturday night. But like the compromise of doing something like this under the shadow of a pandemic and having an immunocompromised family is like, I'm going to be trying to see a lot of friends outside and like probably taking like cosplay from outside, but like not actually spending too much time. Like I'm not going to be attending many panels or anything like that. And that sucks, but it's the situation that we're in. So I'm trying to like take a positive spin on that.
And can we see more from you in the future? What's coming out for you next? Not necessarily Star Wars, but other work.
So just before the Star Wars release back in January, I had my book called Light Years from Home came out. So if you're a fan of X-Files, the way that book is kind of like X-Files without Mulder and Scully. It's like about like, you know, the families in X-Files. Like if you just focused on like, how are they dealing with this alien abduction? Like that's what that book is about. And then I have a book coming out next January called Vampire Weekend. And that's the most wholesome vampire book ever written. It's about a woman who uses her immortality to play in bands and go to a lot of punk shows, but then she has to confront her family trauma that she never dealt with before. I have found people who read my prior books and then they read Brotherhood and they're like, oh, Brotherhood is a Mike Chen Star Wars book. Like it feels that way. And it's very much like just character driven. So if you like that and you want to dip into other subgenres that don't involve licensed characters, I think you'll feel the same vibe in my other books.
Well, I'm glad we've had the time to talk through the book. Absolutely loved it. You should be very proud of this. It's excellent work.
Thank you so much. Like I said, I feel relief that I didn't mess up Star Wars.
Thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this special edition of Cannon Fodder. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the free Fanthatracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Fanthatracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Fanthatracks intro, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Remember, tune in to Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings, 9 o'clock UK time, 4 PM Eastern, 1 PM Pacific on Facebook and YouTube. And check out Fanthatracks Radio episodes on Friday evenings at 7 o'clock UK time for brand new episodes of The Fantha from Down Under, Planet Leia, Desert Planet Discs, Start Your Engines, and Cannon Fodder. And we'll see you next month.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's Making Tracks.